Hello and welcome to CNBC TV 18. I'm Malvika Jain. I am in New York and I have with me Dr. Arvind Panagariya, the former vice chairman of the Niti Aayog and a professor at Columbia University in the United States of America. Dr. Panagariya, welcome to CNBC TV 18.
Pleased to be with you, Malvika.
Well, my first question to you is that what do you make of the decline in growth rates that India is witnessing at this point in time?
Well, I've been drawing this comparison with what happened under UPA 2, particularly in its last 2 years, and what we see today. I think there is a vast difference between the two situations. Today, we are macroeconomically very stable. Inflation is low, current account deficit is low, our exchange rate has been stable, foreign exchange reserves are in good shape. So macroeconomically, we are in a very good spot. Fiscal deficit is also very much under control. What has happened is that the growth rate has declined in the last 2 quarters below 7%. Now,
way below 7%.
Well, it's sure, but what I'm saying is that the other than these 2 quarters, right, 6.1 and 5.7, all other quarters prior to that, in the immediate vicinity, if you look at, have been 7% or more. So, therefore, there is only 2 of these quarters during which we see growth declining below 7%. There are good explanations for it, right? Because the government has introduced a number of reforms, but particularly if you look at it, demonetization, GST, and now we are also trying to clean up the NPAs. And these 3 major changes are going to lead to and are already leading to a lot of restructuring of the economy.
Would you call demonetization a reform or a hiccup?
No, this was a reform also. Remember that a number of things, this is a part of the Prime Minister's plan to address the issue of black money. And this was one of a series of things that the Prime Minister introduced. So in my thinking, certainly it continues to be very much a reform.
But a lot of critics are saying that there were different ways in which the government could have approached both the GST and demonetization. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, look, on demonetization, clearly you needed a huge amount of confidentiality. This is not something that has ever been done before, anywhere, at any point in time. And therefore, there was very little to go by. So for both of those reasons, I think, it's very difficult to foresee many of the things that happened. And the government then had to actually, evolve its policies as it went forward, as the situation unfolded. Fair enough, there are things which you could have handled differently, but in a broad way, there was no experience to go by. Now, the next time, if anybody ever tries this, they will have the Indian experience in front of them.
But going forward, what would be your recommendations to the new vice chairman of the Niti Aayog? Of course, he has been very critical of foreign helicoptered experts, so to speak, in his words. But if there were a few low-lying fruits that you could identify for him, the agenda that you'd set, what could he take forward?
Well, I think it's not so much, I really would not suggest anything for the successor, because I think, by and large, I believe in the principle that you should not either evaluate or advise your successor or your predecessor for that matter, and I've generally refrained from doing that. But I can certainly suggest things that the country can do.
Certainly.
And on that, I would say, there is a set of reforms that are in the pipeline already. The reform of the Medical Council of India, the reform of higher education system, the disinvestment program, and of course, above all, relatedly, particularly to the disinvestment program, the cleaning of the NPAs. I think these 4 are reforms which are already in the process, and I think if we complete those, and some rejigging of the tax rates in the GST and some related issues related to GST, particularly for the exporters, many of the indirect taxes that are still not being fully reimbursed before products get exported. I think that needs to be addressed as well. I think that set of reforms by themselves actually could make a major change.
I do want to talk about disinvestment in NPAs, but you mentioned about the GST, of how rates can be rationalized. But the bigger problem that the informal sector is facing is that it's the buyer who has to maintain the records. Even if you're exempting the smaller people, how do they deal with this situation?
Remember that a lot of the sellers who are less than 20 lakhs are sellers to the final consumer. And the final consumer is not looking for any reimbursement. Therefore, no paperwork is required to be done when you are selling your product to the final
So you're suggesting
consumer.
That when it comes to B2B, they should have it?
Well, if it is...
Because practically that's what is happening.
If it is B2B, in which the buyer says that I am not going to buy from you unless you also filed your tax return, then of course you got to, it's incumbent upon you to file. But then that is also helping you grow your own business. So it is rational for you to actually file the returns.
So going forward, you talked about labor reforms, and you had said that that is one of the major impediments when it comes to corporate growth. Did you find many takers for your suggestions? Were you able to garner support within the government?
Well, I think a lot of the states have in fact now gone forward. So the reform process began with Rajasthan raising the limit on the firms who have effective rights to lay off workers from 100 workers to 300 workers. And that particular reform actually did catch on, and several states, including Andhra Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, I think even Haryana, have actually gone ahead. UP always.
What about central legislations?
Meaning?
I mean, at the national level, do you think that there is a need?
Yeah. So, of course, if we could carry out some of these reforms at the national level, then it can happen for the entire country. That has proven hard because the government really doesn't have votes in the Rajya Sabha. And therefore, even if you pass the legislation in Lok Sabha, it cannot.
But some work will be done, even if it is passed in the Lok Sabha. At least the thinking of the government will get reflected.
But remember that this was tried actually in the case of Land Acquisition Act. The government actually went out on its limb, passed the legislation in Lok Sabha, but in the end it could not be carried through in the Rajya Sabha. So now, until and unless the government has the votes, it is not going to make sense to really, spend a lot of negotiating capital on that kind of legislation. So personally, I had taken the view, at least, when I was the Niti Aayog, that we should try to do this through the instrumentality of the states.
But having served as the vice chairman of the Niti Aayog for 2 years, how was your experience in dealing with career bureaucrats? Did you feel that they were open to outside advice and suggestions?
Well, I had no difficulty, I must say. Different bureaucrats are different. And there are certain things some bureaucrats will do, there are certain things some bureaucrats will not do. That is different. I think, that has nothing to do with me being an outsider. And certainly, personally, I never felt an outsider. Prime Minister had asked me to go and serve, and I love my country, so I went and served. And I had very harmonious relations with practically all of the secretaries and additional secretaries and joint secretaries.
I mean, the reason I ask you that question is not just because of you as a personality, but this is a bigger issue. There have been talks of how the civil service should be more open to outsiders at different level in the bureaucracy.
Yeah, but personally, I did not have such a difficulty that they were particularly close to me. Right? I mean, I felt not treated any differently than anybody else who was, let's say, a member of the cabinet of the Prime Minister. So
you were a cabinet rank
yes.
appointed, but you never attended a cabinet meeting.
No, but I was the cabinet rank, but I was not a political appointee.
Right.
Right. So I did go once or twice when the Prime Minister invited me, but as a matter of routine, I did not.
Right. And going back to the reform agenda, the low-hanging fruits that we were talking about, you mentioned about NPAs and disinvestment.
This is the first time, finally, I think for a long time, the RBI took no initiative to clean up the NPAs, and this new RBI governor has in fact taken up the matter, and progress is happening. And there is no issue with anybody being bailed out here. In fact, haircuts will have to be taken. Banks that issued loans which they should not have issued will have to not take haircut.
But there is a recommendation, a broader suggestion that a separate institution should be created. That sort of...
Yeah, this was all discussed and when I was there and all. And initially, in fact, I was the first one to advocate that create a asset company.
Do you see that happening?
No, but I changed my mind later actually, simply because it is a difficult thing to do. There are existing such asset companies which are in the private sector, which in principle can be used, and they will be used as the process unfolds. If we had actually tried to create a public sector company to move these assets into that company, then the process would have taken much longer.
Right.
And we would not be as far along as we are today. So I think the government has taken the right approach, and the process is underway.
And so what about the issue of disinvestments? If you could lay out a roadmap for me, where do you think things are moving and what direction are they taking?
Yeah, so I think, this was one area in which we at Niti Aayog had made a very big push when I was the Vice Chairman. And we had sent almost about 3 different lists of enterprises. A lot of work was done actually because, to come to the list, you have to study each of these single enterprise that you are going to recommend or not recommend for disinvestment, evaluate them and make the case for disinvestment. All of that was done. Actually, our first list was even approved by the Cabinet Committee on Economic Affairs, the CCEA. And then it went to the DIPAM, the Department of Investment and Public Asset Management, which is where things then slowed down.
Right.
And some progress has happened at DIPAM. They have appointed transactions advisors.
Is there a particular reason why things slowed down?
So I don't know. I think this is where, I said earlier that different bureaucrats work differently. Whether it was the Secretary DIPAM or something else in the Finance Ministry, or I do not know. But that is where the matters seem to have slowed down. And contrary to my expectation, frankly, before I left, I had expected several of these disinvestments would actually become reality. It did not happen. But I think this is really a good time because in the current budget, we are going to need probably a lot more resources to recapitalize the banks. Now, as we clean up the NPAs, it is also there is the related issue of restoring the health of the balance sheets of the PSBs, the public sector banks. And for that, you need resources. A lot more resources than has been provided for in the current budget.
Right.
Where are those resources going to come from? And this is where I feel now, that this investment becomes that much more important now. Not only it is the right policy in the sense of, taking the enterprises that can be actually carried forward in private sector and that do not serve much of public purpose. I think the efficient thing to do is to have them in the private sector. So from efficiency perspective, that makes sense. But from the revenue perspective, it is even more important today.
My last question to you is that you repeatedly make a comparison between the UPA regime and the the BJP-led, the NDA government. Just in summary, you don't think that the economy really needs a push right now? And so far, whatever the government has done, I shouldn't say whatever, but most of the things that the government has done is more marketing and less work. And now that is why the situation is becoming more intense?
No. Why do you say that? I think the government, first of all, there are a number of reforms that the government has already done, which I have mentioned just now, but there are a number of this which will take a long time to describe. So first, a lot of good work has been done.
But you think the hopes have been set way too high and it's impossible for the government to achieve it? Because suddenly there is from all the speeches that I hear from the Prime Minister, from the Finance Minister, there is a lot of emphasis on how the young Indian population is very aspirational. Are we blaming their aspirations for our failures?
No. But you're forgetting that during the 3 full years for which we have the data, the economy has grown 7.5%. So that's no joke. And that's higher than any other major economy in the world today. So all you're referring to me is the decline in the growth rate in the last 2 quarters. I will wait and see, because nothing else in the economy that I see makes me fear that something fundamentally is wrong. Exports have in fact picked up. Exports have, August figures for exports, there is a 10% growth figure that has come in. Well, manufacturing has always had a difficulty in India.
Before I let you go, I just want to ask you, are you going to continue to engage with the government at some other level, if not with the Niti Aayog?
Well, no. I mean, through this interview, as well as through some of my writings, I will continue to give my views, and maybe some of that the government would like and follow through. Most of it, I'm sure, like all the commentators, will also get ignored. So.
Wonderful, Dr. Panagariya. Thank you for your time. It was a pleasure speaking to you. We were in conversation with Dr. Arvind Panagariya, the former Vice Chairman of the Niti Aayog and a professor at Columbia University.